Okay, hi everyone. So good to see you all again. If you're sticking with us, we're now in part two of Black Women in Education, higher ed, with some awesome panelists, Tiara Cash and Marsha McNair. Thank you guys both so much for being here with us today. I'm just going to do like quick intro. I'm not going to go as long as I did in the other panel because we might have some repeat viewers, but just want to frame our conversation just a little bit. But before we get into it, I do want to take a moment of silence to honor our fallen heroes, our fallen civil rights heroes. So let's just take 60 seconds of silence, please. Okay, we've done our 60 seconds in honor of our civil rights heroes that we've just lost within the last 24 to 48 hours. So before I get into who I am and what we're doing here today, I do just have some shout outs that I want to give out. I want to actually shout out my sisters. I'm the oldest of four girls, and all of my sisters have been instrumental in helping me with the work that we've been doing. My sister Sharita has built my website. My sister Naima has been doing my social media. She's going to be in the chat here on YouTube and really helping us facilitate. And she also created the new logo. So thanks so much, Naima. And I also want to shout out my sister Tamika, who is a spiritual advisor, and will be sending out discounts to some of her products as a result of her sponsoring our sessions today. So thank you. I'm always about elevating Black businesses. How amazing that I can elevate my sisters at the same time, and also be a part of the sisterhood. Right? We've got the sisterhood here with Tiara and Marsha. I'm so happy to have you all here. So let me just talk a little bit about why we're here, why we think it's important. So my motto is peace, positive education always causes elevation, right? So I'm always thinking of different spaces that we can knowledge share, that we can bring our learning to the table and continue to grow and learn and be better and create a better world, not only for ourselves, but also for the generations after us. And I truly believe that education is the civil rights movement of our time. Having knowledge and being able to share that knowledge, create discussion is so important. It is so true that people can take lots of things away from you, but they can't take away what you know and what you learn and how you go through the space. Education is radical and it's a driver of change. And when I talk about education, I don't mean just K-12 public education. I don't mean what we're going to be talking about today, higher education. I'm talking about the type of education that you desire, that you design, that you define, that leads to the quality of life that you want, right? The success metrics that we determine for ourselves, which should not be centered on white ideology, not on corporate speak, not on what Merriam and Webster says is okay, but in what we want and in what we value. We've opened up this space so that it's not just Black women talking to other Black women. We want everyone to be part of this conversation because it's not just about preaching to the choir. It's really about us elevating the excellence and the amazingness of Black women and our experiences, but then using that as a lever and a driver of change to really fight to really fight racist racist work and to really think about the injustices and inequities that we have in the world today. Um, I just got to say it. We are some bad sisters on this panel right now. Okay, you are about to listen to some amazing Black talent, and what's amazing is not only is the Black talent here, but there's Black talent everywhere around you. And if you don't know who those people are, you are not living your full life. It's really important for me to just elevate the fact that we are committed to this work. For us to be panelists, for us to put all this together, takes a lot of work and time and effort. There's an emotional tax to elevate our voices as Black women. We are constantly being told that we're angry, that we're aggressive, for all of these negative things, and so we really want to change that narrative, show the positive side. But with that, that elevates us to a place where we're a target. And we saw that the first time that we were trying to do this panel, we were targeted and we were tried to be silenced. So just think about the emotional effect it takes to do it one time, to say, even though you did that, we're still going to fight, and we're going to be fearless, and we're going to be courageous, because this work is just so important to us. This is what it means for us to be here and in this space. And so I want to thank you for being a part of that. I want to just talk about how we got here to be in this space. Like, why do I put together and elevate Black women's voices and create these spaces of us to showcase our talent that anyone and everyone can be involved in? So I'll just give a little history. First and foremost, I love creating just spaces of hanging out with my sisters, right? No matter where I am, I go out, we do happy hour, we kiki, I travel around the country, and I get us all together, and we do it. We do the darn thing, and then we all become lifelong friends somehow, which has been amazing and just wonderful. And there's something really beautiful and positive about that work. And so the question was, how can we elevate that to the next level, and really have other people experience it? This is one reason why we started I Am a Black Woman, Yes, I Matter. The other is when I came together with Marsha, who was on our panel, and I produced her play, Sisters on Fire. And as part of that Sisters on Fire piece in the East Village in New York City, we would have these audience talkbacks. And the talkbacks were so illuminating and enlightening that we decided, wouldn't this be awesome if we could take that same feeling and bring it into different communities? And that's what we did. And then the coronavirus hit. And so we decided, let's make it virtual. Let's create these spaces virtually. So we started our first one a couple months ago, where we had people all across the globe talking about how the pandemic has really affected Black lives. And it was such a hit and a success. People were like, can we get more? And so I heard you, and here we are. So we've gotten two today: Black women in education. You heard early childhood and K-12, and now we're going into higher ed. I do just ask for some grace as I switched over to sharing my screen. This is a new platform for me, so if you see any technical glitches, just be graceful about it. We're going to get back on track, all that good stuff. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay, if you were with us for the previous panel, you have seen this piece. Let me just make sure that it's up here. Great. Okay, you have seen the panels that are here and that are highlighted, but I wanted to talk about them again because I think it's just so important that we really discuss some of this as we think about the ways that we need to think about education, restructure education here in the US, especially as it comes to higher ed. So the way that education has been structured in our country has been about erasing, devaluing Black lives, experiences, and people. And we see that just by the type of reading that our students in K-12 and our students in universities, community colleges, and graduate school are experiencing. It comes from a white narrative, white story. 80% of the literature that we see is from that perspective. And just by virtue of holding those up, we are devaluing Black lives, Black experiences, and Black history. Oops, and I realized I didn't go into present mode. Sorry. Let me swing over. Okay. I want to talk, because we're talking higher ed, and a lot of times when people think about affirmative action, they really think about affirmative action as, I don't know, a get into college for free card if you have Black skin. And I'm sure those of us who do have dark skin know that that is completely erroneous. That in fact, most of the time, in order to get into these institutions, we still have to work twice as hard in order to be considered, let alone be accepted into these spaces. So I wanted to just bring up what the real thought around affirmative action, access, equity, and school choice. And some of you may remember these stories, right? These were stories of Black mothers who were trying to ensure a higher quality of education, activate school choice for their students. And they were found to have, I guess, falsified an address so that their students could go to a better school. And as a result of that, I just want you to think about that. As a result of just wanting something positive for your child, these women were sent to jail. And not sent to jail for like a day, you know, and then fined. I mean, sent to jail for months, even years at a time, all because they wanted school choice, access, and equity for their students. And then we have the real affirmative action. And this is what I call white privilege, right? This is the real affirmative action that happens all the time. We know about the college scandal that's currently going on at the moment, but that's just one instance that has been elevated. We know about obviously the nepotism. We know about students who are allowed to go to colleges because their parents donate money to those particular schools. They have a legacy at those particular schools. A number of our presidents have gone to Ivy League colleges for that reason only. And so, in lots of ways, white people have had real affirmative action this entire time in order to create the disparities in the quality of education that they have versus the quality of education that Black and Indigenous people of color have been able to receive. So I want us to keep that frame in mind as we're talking through some of the experiences of both students, faculty, and professionals at the higher ed space. I stole these last two slides from our former panelist, Mia Howard. She was on our early childhood and K-12, but I just thought that this was really important to elevate these thoughts around what does it mean to lead while Black? All of us here on this panel lead organizations, lead schools, are in positions of power one way or another. And it's really complicated, right, if you're a Black person. We are perceived as angry. We are oftentimes are being questioned, even in this moment of time, in 2020, right now, in the midst of all the things that are going on, we are being questioned around the ways that we think about things. We are being told to ask and think about how others feel. Let's not make people cry. When all we're talking about is elevating our experiences and becoming equitable in the ways that we make decisions. I also thought that this last slide was really powerful, and this was a little bit about some action steps, but this quote by Ayanna Pressley, I think, is so key, and it's something that we need to be thinking about. If you're thinking, how can I ensure that my organization is really doing anti-racist work, is really thinking about equity, and is really trying to dismantle racism, the question you should ask yourself is, are the people closest to the pain closest to the power? So are the people closest to the pain closest to the power? And that can look so many different ways. But when I think about higher ed, I think about it from a professorial lens. So what is the faculty made out of? I think about it from a philanthropic lens. So when you're thinking about your board of directors, your funders, are those organizations that keep equity in mind, and are they equity focused? And then also when we're thinking about higher ed and you're thinking about curriculum, case studies, etc., are they coming from diverse minds and voices, or are we mostly elevating the voices of white people, especially white men? I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen and just go to the panelists. I would love for Marsha to kick us off. They're going to just do an introduction and then highlight some extra things after that. Marsha.
Well, for Mara, first, I wanted to thank you for reorganizing this event after the Zoom bombing by white racists. I really appreciate your courage and perseverance, and I see it as a metaphor for the African American experience in this country. We would not be here today if it were not for that same courage and perseverance of our ancestors who were constantly confronted by white terrorism in their daily lives. So first, I just wanted to thank you. And as you said, this was not an easy task, but it is such a necessary task at this time in history because we truly are at a turning point in education. And I think it's an opportunity for us to take advantage of because it doesn't come around that often. I decided to structure my talk around some of the questions that people sent in because as I was reading the questions, I realized these questions really get to the heart of the matter about what we need to discuss in regards to Blacks, African Americans in higher education. So I wrote down the questions. I'm going to read my notes if you all don't mind. And one of the first questions that intrigued me was, what's the role of education to fight inequities? Great question. Education, in my opinion, has a critical role in deconstructing racism and all of the social inequities. It has a critical role. Basically, we are where we are now because our educational institutions have not embraced this role fully. So let me give you an example. Many colleges and universities have courses in pluralism and diversity that satisfy your general education credits, but they're still not required courses. They're mostly elective. So let's think about that. The fact that students often, they have an option of not taking those courses. And even when they are required, and I thought about this, not just in regards to my own institution, but my experience as a student at various institutions. The administration has figured out a clever way, let me be more blunt, a very sneaky way to include courses in pluralism and diversity to satisfy that requirement that do not necessarily have anything to do with African American culture. So students can satisfy those requirements, right? But not take a course related to African American culture. I'll give you an example, and not to trivialize the importance of African civilization, right? We know having an understanding of that, a knowledge of that, studying that is very important. But taking such a course and never taking a course centered on African American culture means students never receive an education in the very factors that have led to the explosive racial situation we have today. So that's why there is this confusion among the general public, even among people who are college educated, because even if they took a course in diversity, it didn't necessarily have anything to do with the African American experience. So the other question I want to address, which I think this is a really dynamic question, whoever wrote this, thank you. How do you bring attention to the anti-Blackness that is rampant in education? And I think, I appreciate the fact that at least people are realizing that anti-Blackness is rampant in education. There was a time when we didn't know how to articulate that. So it's real important that we've gotten to this point where we do get its anti-Blackness. I think the main way to eradicate it is to bring attention to it, because many people are just simply not acknowledging it. And, though whites may not be fully aware of their white privilege, they do know that racism exists. They simply have no motivation to change the status quo. because the status quo does what? It benefits them. So this is why they usually don't make a change unless they are under duress. And that's what all of the protests are about. It's they are under duress. So it's not suddenly a moment of enlightenment or a sudden empathy with people of color. It's they're under duress. So, think about the Confederate flag. I seriously doubt there were many whites who did not understand that symbolism. The only reason those flags are being removed now is what? Out of fear of the protesters. So that's the first thing we've got to understand about how things not just work in this country, but how they work within any institution. And so what I really liked about a subset of this theme of Blacks in Education, Pomara, is this idea you put forth of positive action steps. Because very often we have these types of gatherings and they simply degenerate into complaining or analysis paralysis. I like that you emphasize the idea that we should think about what do we do about it? What can we do in a positive way to change the situation? So I think that people of color and progressive whites, which within these institutions, for one thing, have been trying to address these issues. I want to make that clear. It doesn't seem like it because, people have seen very little change, but I know where I work, and there are many colleagues where I've worked who have been trying to change the situation for years. So this question made me think about, then why didn't things change? And I think what the public needs to understand is that college is a business. Higher ed is a business. And sometimes we don't recognize that because we are used to this free public school education system, which actually isn't free, right? Your tax dollars pay for it. But college is a business. It's about money. And so if we really want to eradicate anti-Blackness in institutions of higher education, we need to use the time-honored method, the method that we've used during the civil rights movement. Why did they have the Montgomery bus boycott? It wasn't simply because Rosa was being arrested for not sitting at the back of the bus. That wasn't it. It was the idea of, hit them in the pockets, stop riding the bus, walk. That's what brought about the Supreme Court ruling against segregation on public buses, right? It had to do with the money. So when we're thinking about college and that college is a business, your tuition dollars are a form of power. Where you take those tuition dollars, you have choice about that, unlike when you are in elementary and secondary school where it's based upon geography, but that's not true. And when you are choosing an institution of higher education, you make that choice where your tuition dollars go. So parents and students should use this power to demand change. Or if the institution doesn't change, let them know you are going to take your tuition dollars elsewhere. Even in public institutions, I work at Nassau Community College, and a lot of the budget is based on tax dollars. Still, those tuition dollars do matter. Colleges need them, whether they are public or private. And so we need to use that power. And in many ways, parents and students have that kind of power that people within the institution do not have. Because we are what, as faculty, we're getting paid. We are bringing money to the institution, but they don't see it in the same way as your tuition dollars, your grant money. So how do you do that? When you are unhappy about anything, make sure you get in touch with the school. You have a right to email the president, get in touch with the deans, right? Make sure that your child is involved with student organizations and has a voice. Also, community groups need to be more vocal about the changes they want to see, right? Because most colleges are fiercely protective of their public image because a bad reputation does what? It affects enrollment, fewer tuition dollars, right? So they are protective of that reputation. So they are more likely to be accommodating of students and parents and even community groups. Another thing I thought of, and I'm glad this came to mind because the power of this group is really underestimated. Alumni groups. They are powerful because they raise money for the college. So even if you do not have a child who is in college right now, if you're a college graduate, you have a right to join that alumni group. And that alumni group has what? It has power. You should make sure your alumni group is taking a stand on anti-racism, right? What else? Well, there was another question here that said, what's the state of education today and what needs to change? I could go on and on describing the damaging effect of the coronavirus on education, but instead, I'd like to focus on what the African American community needs to do to prepare our children, because this paradigm shift is not temporary. They might be telling us it is not. Things are not going to ever be the same in the field of education. People tend to think once a vaccine is found, we'll just all go back to normal. No. So we really have to prepare our children for this new future in education and higher education in particularly. Our children need to have access to technology and training and how to use it. We assume, us older folks, that because we see our youth on Facebook and YouTube, and they're always on their phone, that they have this very advanced technological skill. The skills that you need to post on Facebook are very different than the ones you need when you are taking an online class. And I can testify to that because I've been teaching online for over 10 years now. And what I have noticed in my class is that my students of color have a much harder time with the technology. So we need to be proactive and make sure that we're getting ahead of all of what's to come. And one thing I was thinking about was the role in which our churches, our community-based organizations can play. They can be what? These two groups, which people are very comfortable with in the community, they can really spearhead this movement that we embrace the technology, make the technology available. Many of our children have phones, but they don't have laptops, they don't have computers. Our community-based organizations and our churches can make this technology available. And already our public libraries typically have computer centers, right? And they are going about the process right now of making sure that social distancing is practiced so that they can make those computer centers available to the community again. But the library is not enough. It can only serve so many people. So I really do want to see churches and community-based organizations become more involved with this aspect. I don't see a problem with a church having an internet cafe. These places are all over Africa, Asia, and Europe, but we see very few internet cafes in our communities, if we see any. I think lastly, if there's not a group in your community, create one and become a nonprofit so that you can go after government funding. That would be a great way to get your internet cafe started, your training group started. You know, the group that I founded, Long Island Girl Talk, we're now working with a group called Bold Minds, and both of us, both African American women, we're both educators. We started both of these groups with little or no funding. So it is possible for you to do that. And I think, in short, and I hope I haven't gone on too long, because I actually got excited about some of these ideas because, as I said, I'm not one to want to dwell on a problem too long, but I love talking about solutions. In short, we need to take control of our destiny and not leave it in the hand of others.
Marsha, that's so true. I mean, you and I have talked about this so much around taking control of our own stories, our own education. And this is part of what this is all about. How do we do that? How do we equip people to really start changing the narrative, and we can start elevating our voices, our own values, our own ways of working through the world? I love the fact that you brought up that oftentimes I think people feel powerless against these big institutions, but in fact, we hold the power, we hold the money, we make the choices as to where we go. And once you go through that, it's not like you're done with college and you should never ever interact with them again. You absolutely should join your alumni association. You should be an active member of your alumni because you can absolutely start changing the ways in which things are moving, right? Quick little aside, one of my best friends and another good friend of hers started the Multicultural Alumni Association for our college and university, and then we created an endowment of which my family and I have, donated some money to it. But what was great is that we could affect the access to this education for our students of color. So for people who couldn't meet that financial requirement to get into the school, I mean, they got into the school, but they didn't have the financial backing in order to actually accept, we were able to change lives like that. All because we wanted to be a part of the Alumni Association and have an effect around the way this school interacts with its students of color and how it has a nice pipeline of diversity coming through. So I just wanted to highlight that because I think it's so important. In lots of ways, when you think you're powerless, you actually hold a lot of power. Think about where you hold those spaces of power and use it to your advantage. All right, Tiara, let's hear from you. I'm so excited.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kumara, again, for this opportunity and for making sure that Black women and Black people have a brave space. Just like Marsha said earlier, being able to do this again, really for myself, it's all about resilience. It's all about bouncing back and making sure that we create these brave spaces for each other. So thank you for that opportunity. As mentioned in my bio, my background is in higher education and specifically in the well-being spaces. So today I really hope to be a resource in both illuminating some of our experiences as Black women in education, but also really talk about self-care for Black students and the importance of it as an educator or an administrator in the university setting. So my work also focuses on teaching ways of practicing and inserting mindfulness into one's daily life and into education, which is really important when we're talking about creating diverse and inclusive spaces. So just to give a brief background in mindfulness, to set the stage for some of the answers that I might have to some of these questions. Mindfulness is paying attention to each present moment with intention. And we can shorten that to focus awareness, being in the moment, but it's mainly a practice that helps us to cultivate self-awareness. And it really increases our ability to engage in self-care and self-discovery. It also has the ability to be a foundation for equitable practices like we just talked about and inclusive spaces. And so I'm going to try as much as possible to talk from that lens when we're talking about using mindfulness in education curriculum. The practice itself is not new. It's not something that Western society's made up. It is not something that the medical community made up. It's actually an ancient and deeply rooted practice that's been exercised by most people around the world. And really, in my opinion, my personal opinion, Black folks and specifically Black women are some of the most mindful people on this entire planet because we have had to be to survive, number one, but we also are master cultivators of mindfulness in many ways. When we cook, when we pray, when we sing, when we get into the zone during a game, when we're at work, you know, we tap into that inner self that I spoke about earlier so effortlessly. And thinking about why this is important in the higher education sector, a couple of data points. So studies from the ACHA, the American College of Health Association, and national comparisons by the NRG, the National Reference Group, give us a window into the life of a college student. So we know that 85% of our students nationally are overwhelmed on a daily basis. 85%. 63% report being very sad and 55% report being very lonely. So astonishingly enough, only about 30% of college students report feeling that their life has a purpose in contrast to that. So only 30% feel like their life has a purpose, has meaning, and is worthwhile. So there are huge implications there for the impact of these statistics on mental health and well-being of our college students. And I can't even imagine that reflection that this has again on educators, because we're the ones who are trying as much as possible to cultivate those spaces of learning. So if they're stressed out and they're overwhelmed, I know for a fact that we are as well. So it's really important that we think about that holistically, but even going further into Black and Brown students and their experiences, we also have to take into account things that may not show up on these national data points. So racial and intergenerational traumas, the importance of imposter syndrome, specifically in spaces like being in business sectors, lawyers, psychologists. Imposter syndrome is rampant in these spaces. Experiences of tokenism at these colleges and universities and in these classes, and so much more that we don't normally see as a part of this data set, but understanding that these are experiences of our Black and Brown students on top of these other statistics of being overwhelmed, of feeling very sad, of feeling very lonely. They're also having these other statistics on top of that. So today I'll speak really heavily from a mindfulness perspective, but for the intent of using these practices in the classroom and higher education to influence health outcomes and overall well-being. I'll talk about radical self-care. I think there's a question that we have about that. So how to think about it, see it, embody it in your life, but also to help, students and educators to explore self-discovery and find meaning. Because just like we talked about with that 30% statistic, how do we change that? Well, we can use some of these practices to try to really understand that self-actualization process that goes along with being a student or an educator in these higher education spaces. So I look forward to hearing the questions today, answering the questions. I'm really excited to share this space with the panel, Marsha and Kumara. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. So I would love for us to talk a little bit about our just personal journeys. I mentioned at the beginning that we hold spheres of influence, that we hold positions of power in the different spaces that we're in, especially in higher education or in education in general. And I would love, and I've had questions about, like, how did we get here? So tell us a little bit about your journey to get to this space.
Well, when I was watching your presentation, I'm so glad you brought up the issue of affirmative action and kind of maybe go back in time to when I was in college and I went to Dartmouth, and I remember when the whole Alan Bakke, I still remember his name. I can't remember. I can't believe it. It's 40 years later, 50 years later. I still remember his name. And he was a white medical student who did not get into medical school and sued the university. I can't remember which school it was, because he said that there were students of color who weren't as qualified as he was, who were accepted into the college instead of him. And I remember, thinking to myself, here this case is going on, and the campus was very divided by it. And yet, at Dartmouth, we had a quota on women. We did not have equal access. They had a quota on women. It didn't, after a certain number of women were admitted, they did not admit anymore whether or not you were qualified. And so our big fight there was for equal access. But I think just the pure hypocrisy, right, of supporting an Alan Bakke and yet not seeing your own lack of your own, this thing with sexism and racism is so intertwined, but not seeing your own part in that, right, and having a quota system, and yet wanting to, challenge a quota system that was just meant to what? Equalize the playing field, because for, throughout history, students of color were not admitted to colleges and to graduate schools based on their qualifications. They were denied access because of that. And so affirmative action came about to kind of level this playing field a little bit. But I just thought about the irony of a school that had a quota, to actually really be arguing on the side of Alan Bakke. It just, thank you for bringing up that issue. And, here's the whole thing. Our students know very little of history. They don't know the history of the Alan Bakke case. They don't know why affirmative action was created. I've had these discussions in my classes, and they think that people of color are just being given a preference. They don't understand the rationale behind it because it's not being taught in our schools. And so that's why I think it's so very important that African American culture is not just taught at the higher education level. This needs to be incorporated in general history, because it is American history, right? And so this is where a lot of the confusions that students have, a lot of the anti-Black sentiment comes. I remember, this is a great story, and then I'll shut up and let Tiara, you had great comments, so I want to hear from you. But I remember a student in my class asking me, why is it that African Americans had their own special schools? Whites don't have their own special schools. And I was shocked. I was like, wait a minute. I realized people don't know the history of historically Black colleges. They were not created because we were thought to be special and we deserved our very own schools. They were created because they did not want to integrate with us. But do you see what I'm saying? There are students don't know the history of this stuff. So that's where some of their own racism is coming from, right? They don't get why we had historically Black colleges.
Well, I definitely think that everyone is a product of the system that's designed to elevate
Right.
white normatives. All of us are. Anyone who's been born in this country, we are all a victim of that. And part of that is to deconstruct. Part of these talks really is part of deconstructing it, recognizing it within ourselves, and then changing it, and then hopefully changing the systems by using our spheres of influences, by when we are sitting at tables not being silent, but realizing that we have a duty to speak up, realizing that we have a duty to vote, realizing that we have a duty not only to just vote politically, but we can vote with our dollars, right? We can vote with where we
Mhm.
decide to send our children to school, or where we decide to go to school.
Right.
We vote those kinds of ways, and I think that that's important. Lots of people have been taught and believe they have no power because they don't have money or they don't have XYZ. It's not true. By virtue of you being a person who was born in this country, you have lots of power. The question is, how can you use it and utilize it? All right, Tara, tell us a little bit about how you got here.
All right, thank you so much. So I'll give you a little bit of personal background as to how I got here, and then I want to talk a little bit about why I stay here, which is part of that piece that you were just talking about the power and the influence that we have, and what my personal drive behind this is. So, I've been in a family of educators for as many generations back as possible. I learned that on my father's side, one of my great great grandparents was the first educator, Black educator in Tennessee. So huge educational roots. But I think my mother was a huge influence in my life when it came to being in higher education. She was a collegiate coach, and she was also a lecturer. And I grew up in the university system, I guess you could say, both watching her mold and empower and educate women, specifically Black women in Tennessee, and seeing how she had so much influence and power by just being authentic and being there and showing up and influencing these life lessons. And so that really, I knew from a child, like when I was a child, that I was going to work in higher education because of that. I was like, you know what, this is my space, this is what I'm going to do, this is where I'm going to be. But specifically with these well-being practices, I started working in athletics and recreation, again, talking about from that space of having that familial influence. But I grew up with mindfulness practices as a part of my life since I was really young. And so this position now in higher education really allowed me to kind of combine all of those different ideologies of really influencing and trying to empower young people, but also understanding that we have tools that we have in our own toolbox that we just have to work on and pull out in order to be the people that we want to be in these spaces. And so that was really my reason for being here. But talking about influential practices, right? Like what drives us to continue to stay in this space? What's the point of being in these spaces, specifically as Black women? I think in higher education, Black women deal with so much more than a lot of folks realize. And it comes with the fear of having to shrink ourselves down in order to be relevant, or in some cases to elevate, especially in academia and research. And so I've seen this in so many different ways personally with my own path. But I realized that one of my strengths is actually being strong, outgoing, gifted, and showing up in this body, right? Being a Black woman that has all of that, and that my power comes from representing that authenticity and whatever flaws and social nuances that might come, like the tendency to be loud or real or say what's on my mind in these spaces. It really comes from that representation piece. So, what got me here and what helps me to stay in these spaces is understanding that, without even realizing, I'm a representative and a driving force for other women of color, for other Black women specifically, to stay in these spaces and to be real and authentic in these spaces. I'm just going to be me and show up as me as possible. And I think representation is really important.
I think that's great. And I love the fact that you said, like I said on the last panel, that I'm me, right? I'm authentically me. What you see is what you get in all spaces and at all times. But there's a boldness to be that fearless. I would love to hear, if someone is trying to find their authentic self, what advice would you give them? Especially to our students of color who are trying to navigate assimilating maybe into an environment that they're not comfortable with, not having the social network. A lot of times we don't even think about this. We think a lot about, yeah, they have the academics to get into the schools that they're at, but no one thinks about some of the socialization and social networks that they may not have access to, that a lot of their white peers have had access to, and the norms there. And so they're navigating and trying to navigate all of those things simultaneously. So I would love to hear some advice that you guys give to the students that you come across.
I'm thinking, and I'm so glad Tiara brought up this idea of how we are naturally as women of color. And I'm proud to be that way. It is a part of my identity. Yet, what happens when we go into institutions of higher education as faculty, as students, there is a lack of cultural sensitivity there. And so our behavior is often misinterpreted. And what's the dangerous result of that is that you're less likely to be promoted. You're less likely to be mentored. If you are in the classroom, you could be perceived as a threat. You're more likely to be suspended for behavior that is just par for the course in our community. You know, if you're being loud and gregarious, you could be thought of as a troublesome student, a problem student, when this is just a part of your culture. Your behavior can be misinterpreted by your professor. And then what happens as a result of that? You could fail the course. You know, you could be brought up on disciplinary charges. I know there are many incidences where it had nothing to do with the individual's intent. Their behavior was misinterpreted by whites. And I think one reason I have been so successful in working with differently motivated students of color is because I get that, because that's my community, right? I understand when they're being belligerent and when it's a black thing. I know the difference between that. But I've grown to understand that many of my colleagues do not, right? They don't get that. And as a result, the academic performance of our students is not really on equal footing with those of white students, not because our students aren't as intelligent, but because of this lack of cultural sensitivity. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, Marcia, this is so fascinating that you're bringing this up, because we literally talked about this in the last panel, having these cultural gaps start as early as age 3. And so now look, this is going through age 3, K-12. Now we're talking about it in a higher ed space, which then of course affects your career and your professional journey for the rest of your life, right? And so I love the fact that you said that it's not that our kids are not as intelligent or can't get these concepts, right? I actually think that we have been talking about the wrong things. We keep talking about the achievement gap. We keep talking about the opportunity gap. But what it really is a cultural gap, a cultural misunderstanding, and a devaluation of Black experiences and Black lives. If we evaluated Black experiences the way that we did white, we wouldn't find these disparities that we're talking about at all by any means or a stretch of the imagination. And so I'm so, not only like it is like a wow, I guess an Oprah moment, it's like an aha moment for me to hear that college students are getting suspended for behavior and not academics. That is crazy. Tiara?
Yeah, absolutely. And so Marcia really touched on the systematic institutional kind of viewpoint on this. I'll go back to the individual viewpoint and figuring out, how you, like you said, how to show up authentically in these spaces, how to find that kind of self-discovery. I think the first thing is to sit with yourself as much as possible. And that is so difficult for people. It sounds like a very simple thing to say, like, yeah, just sit with yourself. But silence can reveal a lot of hurt and pain and trauma. And so it comes with understanding that that sitting with yourself is going to bring up a lot of things that you might not have seen as one of the reasons why you haven't been authentic in spaces, right? Like you said, those social nuances, understanding that, I'm complicit in the white supremacy system. Like all of those things I had to come to in myself when thinking about how to be authentic. So that's the first thing, is really sit with yourself and really work on finding that authentic self, and then test it out. So, I wouldn't say go all in, don't come into a classroom and think that, who you are today, you need to just give to everybody all the time. Just test it out in little small spaces. And my supervisors can attest to this. Over the past few years, it's like I really started to become myself, and I would just test out small theories in spaces and be like, all right, this, like you said, this is a Black thing. Let me see if they can get it. Let me see if they can understand it. And if not, let me see if I can explain it to them and they're with it. And they were. And so then it became, okay, I can keep doing this in different spaces. Going back to what you said, Kumar, about finding social networks, specifically as a student in college, it's very important. Actively look for people who look, sound, and feel like you in these spaces that you can be real with. So if you're a student in higher education and you're looking to be, to find that authentic self that we're talking about, find people who reflect that in you. Find those social networks, because just like you said, other individuals, specifically white folks, already have the opportunities to have that in professors and teachers. But unfortunately, we don't really have that opportunity. So we need to actively be looking for those spaces. And then going back to something that Marsha said, which I think is really important, is I've really come to this term of quiet radicalism, or being a tempered radical, especially in higher education, where I drop little pearls of radicalism in different, curriculum spaces or in pedagogy. And then, the big institution doesn't realize that's what's happening. So we're changing students' minds, but in a way that's so quiet that they don't even realize it's happening. So I think as an educator, if you can do that, you can ask questions or create spaces for students specifically, and specifically for Black and Brown students, through journaling, through, really deep discussion spaces where they can be their authentic selves in the classroom, then you can create these spaces of tempered radicalism. And I think that that's important as well.
I know that I just saw a comment from Naima Lauren who confirmed what I just said about the unequal justice, even within our institutions of higher education, where our students are more likely to be brought up on disciplinary charges, to be suspended, and so forth. But kind of piggybacking on, our discussion of mindfulness, which I think is very important. It really is essential for students of color, I think more so than others, because our students are under a tremendous amount of stress. And this is one reason that their academic performance is, often not up to the standards that we would like them to be. Our students are dealing with, if they're African American women, racism, sexism. We've got economic disempowerment. There are forms of, microaggressions that they're experiencing on a daily basis. And so for them to be able to focus on their studies, that's kind of tough, And even, when students come to me, and they have throughout the years, and I have tried to be as supportive as possible, I also know that we have a whole system that is set up for them to fail, right? And so I think that's why this needs to be addressed on a societal level, because that system is set up for them to fail. It's putting them under far more pressure than their white colleagues. And then when they do fail, it is thought of as some sort of racial disparity. That is something, Black children are inferior, or these students are, they're disadvantaged. There's no one ever gives a thought to that perhaps white privilege is at work here, and that they're not being graded as fairly as other students, right? One thing I've noticed is that, you know, throughout my many years of teaching, over 30 years now, I've never had, well, let me put it this way. My white male students feel very comfortable and coming up to me and making demands. They're very vocal. They're not happy about something, they challenge me. I rarely have had that with students of color. It's almost as if that idea of it, they're already disempowered by the time they get to college. That's how I see it, right? They already have lost their voice, right? By the time they get to college. And when college is the time when you have to have a voice, right? So that's what's so frightening to me about what's going on in higher education. And I agree, we need these spaces where students can feel comfortable, where they can get support, but at the same time, we're in institutions that do not recognize this at all, right? And they do not, that in their hiring practices, they do not actively recruit faculty of color. There is a lot of nepotism in higher education in terms of hiring, right? There is a lot of cronyism in terms of who is promoted, who is hired, right? So these are all barriers that are set up so that when a student comes into the space, there are very few people of color that they can turn to for support. I don't mean to be a downer.
No, but I think that you're
You
right.
all
I
can
think
tell
that,
me, you know,
yeah,
I'm kind of dealing with that where I work. So I want
right.
to know how, you know, how do we change that?
Yeah. I mean, I think I hear you, and I'm trying to. So one of the things that we're doing, you know, at ASU is using this term equitable mindfulness, which basically is using the foundation of mindfulness to break down societal and cultural barriers to practices of inclusive spaces, right? And so I think that that goes to a little bit back to a little bit of what you're saying, Marcia, of understanding that institutionally, systematically, we have a lot of issues with a lot of structural issues that we need to work through. And so what we're trying to make sure we don't do is to numb down the personal the systematic issues by putting the onus on the person, by putting the onus on the student. Because there is a lot of onus on a student to make sure they succeed, but it's not just on the student. The institution themselves have to change. And so how do we do that? Well, I think it comes from these type of conversations and making sure that we're engaging in understanding that there is an issue in the first place, and having our white counterparts also, you know, talk about this and bring it into their spaces as well. So that's a part of what equitable mindfulness is working on, is bridging those two gaps together and saying, okay, how do we have these type of conversations in a safe and brave space so that everybody can get what they need to learn from these lessons and change the institution itself.
Yeah, I think you guys are both making some really great points. I just want to highlight a comment that one of our participants made. And excuse me if I'm pronouncing your name wrong, but Pramila said that based off of the stuff that you were saying, Marcia, there's a book that we might want to just look at, Monique Morris's Push Out. So I just wanted to highlight that. That's a resource that we can go ahead and read. And while I'm actually highlighting a book, I would love for us to think about. So Marcia, you mentioned earlier that progressive whites who you consider to be true allies in the space. And so one of the things that are during this time, there's so many questions around, like, how can I make sure that I'm a good ally? How can I ensure that I'm raising good ally children in this space? Do you guys have any suggestions around action steps that parents can take to be good allies for themselves, but also to help raise the next generation of anti-racist citizens?
Well, I would say, again, as you were talking about education and availing yourself of the many resources that are there in order to sensitize your children to multiculturalism. And that's not just African American culture, but world cultures. It's shocking to me when you talk to people from other countries how much more they know about world history, other cultures than we do. We don't even have the ability to recognize regional accents in this country. You know, we'll hear someone from Nigeria and think they're from Texas. That's how provincial we are. It's scary to me, and I'm thinking, how is this happening? What's not going on in education where we have this very limited worldview? And so I think even as a parent, recognizing when I was raising my boys that they were not getting exposed to African American history, I made the library my second home. I made sure that because I couldn't afford to buy these materials, you don't have to buy these materials. I went to the library and I got these materials. And if materials were not available at that library, I would request those materials. But the problem is it puts a lot of onus on parents. And I think the onus really should be on society, right? We as Black parents should not be forced or put under any additional pressure than we would be if we were white, right? We're always asked as people of color to go above and beyond the call of duty instead of creating an atmosphere which is fair, right? And so I believe really where this starts for progressive whites is to review the textbooks that their children are bringing home. Go to their PTA and demand, right, a change in the material. When they see something, even if they're not sure if it's offensive, you know, if they know someone of color, ask. I remember, you know, when my boys were growing up, we would get a newsletter from a school, and they grew up in a predominantly Black and Hispanic school district. All of the images in that darn newsletter were of a little white guy. It was really obvious that it was this little white kid or a little white girl. And I'm thinking, who in the heck created this newsletter? And I know you have to use clip art, but better no clip art than that, because how is that supposed to make our children feel when they don't see a representation of themselves in a newsletter that is supposed to be for them and their parents? And so I think too, as educators, it's scary to have a voice in education because this is your job, this is your livelihood, and very often people who do speak up are fired. And that I have seen throughout the years, or they lose their jobs, or they're never promoted, or they are put at a desk job. That is standard, right? So I do get why people of color in education often do not speak up. But I think, Tiara, you were even mentioning the small things that you can do. I forget how you phrased it. It was really cool. The little radicalisms or whatever. Just that person who was doing that newsletter, if they said, oh, you know what? I'm going to change this clip art. I'm not going to say anything. I'm just going to change it. That would make such a difference for everybody in the community who is seeing that newsletter, right? That is in a Black and Hispanic school district that really doesn't represent them at all.
Tiara, there's been a couple of questions for you in the comment section, and I think I can kind of bring them together, and then we can lead into what we're doing for radical self-care after this. But one was, do you have suggestions for how faculty and teachers and students can bring mindfulness into the classroom? And then is there a way to help our Black students use mindfulness to unshackle students from white people fear? So think Karen, think the policing of Black bodies, because there are real consequences for being bold. There are real consequences. So how can we infuse mindfulness as one of our coping strategies for those things?
Those are both fantastic questions. And I think I'm going to actually start with the second question, because I think it relates so deeply to what we're talking about here and what some of the things that you and Marsha have already said. I think, first of all, and thank you deeply for saying this, it is not the responsibility of a Black student to unshackle a white person's fear. And we have to keep saying that out loud and putting that into the space, because it is on the onus of the white person in society to have these type of conversations. Being radical and being bold in spaces is for you, it is not for them. And so I want to make sure that I say that out loud so that people understand that, you know, when we're doing this, it's for your own release, your own liberation. So going back to the white allyship piece, right? So if we're talking about the onus being on the white progressive ally or white ally in general, who's just learning and trying to understand how to be better and show up into these spaces, there's a couple of small things that I think that we can do that are from the perspective, you know, of mindfulness, that can help. And one of those things was something that Marsha already said, right? Work to desegregate your own space by doing small things like changing clip arts, by doing small things like, you know, reading poetry in the home from Black authors, elevate Black and brown and POC and indigenous people in your spaces, with the media, through books, through all of these different things. Let it be normal in the home and not something that, you know, you have to seek out or that children need to seek out. It should be something that just is what it is, right? You know, we grow up learning a lot about white culture because we have to. Let it be the same thing in your home. You let your white children and your white counterparts in the house learn about this because, you know, it's something that's normal. If you're a white ally, educate yourself and then educate those who are like you. So again, that goes back to not putting the onus on the Black students, but to yourself, right? And keep showing up. So when you're engaging, engage and engage deeply. Instead of saying, I'm afraid to engage because I don't know what to say, or I'm working to try to move the conversation to something that's more comfortable for me, because white, you know, being fragile is really something that we're seeing a lot these days, white fragility. Stop, just, you know, keep showing up, right? Keep engaging deeply. It's not helping if you're saying that you're afraid to engage. It's not gonna help further the conversation. So continue to engage deeply, and use the practices of mindfulness to ground yourself in showing up to those conversations. So if you find yourself, specifically, I'm talking again to white allies, but also to those who want to be bold in spaces, being really nervous about having real and authentic conversations around these difficult topics, then take some breaths. Come back to your breath. That's what it's for. It's to allow you to, first of all, physically stimulate that vagal nerve, stop some of those, you know, fight or flight responses, actually calm your body down, but it also signals to your brain that I'm okay. I can do this. There's something happening here in my body and my mind that can allow me to show up in this space. So use those practices when you find yourself feeling like you can't engage, and continue to show up. Going back to the question, I think it was what can we do? What can faculty do in the classroom? So there are a lot of things that I have seen faculty do around the nation to bring mindfulness to the classroom. First of all, literally just doing it. So starting your classroom session with some sort of mindful practice, whether that be 3 breaths together. So everybody, hey, before we start, let's take 3 breaths together. And normalizing that. So it's going to be really weird when students show up and everybody's starting to take 3 breaths. But I've heard from students them say, you know, at first it was weird and I didn't understand why my teacher was doing this. But by the end of the semester, I could see that the way that I showed up, you know, to this class was very different than the way that I showed up to other classes, because I had the opportunity to get back into my breath, to tap back into myself, and just to say, okay, I'm here. I can release all the other things that are happening. Journaling is a really important activity that you can do in reflection practices in the classroom. So if, instead of just seeing essays and those type of things show up, have reflective questions and have people engage deeply in conversation through that. So again, finding ways to use mindfulness to reflect on the topics that you're presenting in the classroom is important. There's many other ways, and I won't go into that because I know we have a limited amount of time, but definitely reach out to me at the center or through my Crown Vita website, and I can definitely give you some more personalized ways to show up in the classroom with these mindfulness practices.
Great. That reminds me, Tiara and Marcia, if you have ways that people can contact you, pop them into the private chat, and then I can put them into the public chat so that people can engage with you all. We have 13 minutes left, and I do want to make sure that we get time to talk about self-care, radical self-care. What are the ways that we are taking care of ourselves during this time, especially as Black women in this space? This is very emotionally taxing work. All the time. We've talked about racial trauma, intergenerational racial trauma. So what are the things that we're doing to ensure that we're taking care of ourselves?
I love this question. I'm going to go back to my role, but first I'm going to talk about it from a personal perspective, because I think radical self-care and self-care in general is so important, specifically for Black women. My process going through, again, I'm going to speak from a mindfulness perspective, has helped me to name and identify what feelings that I might have first. And I think that that's one of the most important steps to understanding how to take care of yourself, specifically in this sort of political and social climate, is to name and identify what's showing up for you. And if you can't, no worries, that's fine, continuing to sit with it. But then just to allow yourself to embody whatever feelings come up after you name it. And so not having to try to change it, but for a moment, just seeing what shows up in your body. How does that feel? And what I mean by that first step in radical self-care is acknowledgement. And again, acknowledgement is important. But really giving back to yourself is understanding that, or in order to give back to yourself, you have to know what you're giving. And so that's the part of acknowledgement. You can't give back to yourself if you don't know what the first step, if you don't know what you're giving back to yourself. So it's not about primping and pampering, but it's also about being honest with what's going on with you. So to answer that question for myself and what I've been telling a lot of other people, I'm going to go back to practicing journaling, naming things, putting it on the paper, and then closing the book and putting it aside. So not having to come back to that right now, leaving it on the paper. Taking a break from social media. Social media right now is drowning us. So if you can, take a break and walk away from that. And then do things like we're talking about. If you're having a lot of these emotions that are showing up in your body physically, if your state isn't shut down, go get a massage with your mask on, of course, but go get a massage and allow them to work out some of those physical kinks that are going on in your body. Again, it gives me a space to actually practice embodying myself while people are working on me, so I can let those and release those stresses there. So that's important. So I do those regularly. But the thing about radical is you do it without apology. And I think that, as Black women, a lot of times we think that we need to ask for apology in order to care for ourselves. And the radical piece is not doing that. I'm gonna care for myself no matter what. I'm gonna show up for myself without asking and without apologizing. And that piece is so important to that self-care. So make sure when you're doing this, you're doing it all out. You're doing it in a space that feels right to you, that's purposeful, that's intentional, that's deep. And make sure you're doing it to fill your own cup, because once you can do that, you can fill up others' cups as well. So those are just a couple of different ways that I think about it. And also, if you're interested in reading Being Black, Zen, and the Art of Leading with Fearlessness by Reverend Angel Kyoto Williams is a fantastic read, and it talks about actionable steps for radical self-care. So.
Thank you, Marcia.
I didn't jump in because I need to know how to take care of myself because I'm not that good at it. But I would want to add something really important for me that did help make my life a lot less stressful was when I truly began to recognize that I was not the problem. I think that's what we all, as people of color, have to figure out, because everything in society really is meant to brainwash us to think we are the problem. We are not a problem. They have the problem. Once I realized I did not have a problem, there was a sense of relief. They have a problem with me. There's nothing wrong with me. There's nothing that I need to do in particular. I don't need to change. It's not me. It's them. I think if we can get that, that's a part of rebuilding the self-worth that they have systematically been destroying in our community for generations. So that is really critical to understand, because often, as we're experiencing these various microaggressions, they do like to plant doubt within us that we did do something wrong or we misinterpreted something. Once I understood, no, no, I did not misinterpret that was racist or that was sexist or that was both. Um, I don't know, I felt a sense of relief, because the self-doubt went away. Yeah, the self-doubt went away. So I would think that, part of mindfulness is releasing that self-doubt. And I'm a big follower of Louise Hay, who was the publisher of Hay House and Tiara. I know you know who Louise Hay is. She's fabulous. Big loss in the self-help and New Age community when she transitioned. But she said something, and I absolutely love this because she's written tons of books. She has a million videos, affirmation CDs. She said something, and it always stuck with me. She said, if you cannot remember anything that I have written, and if videos, the CDs, affirmation, any of this stuff, if you can't remember anything but one thing, this is it. Stop the self-criticism. And that was life-changing for me, because a lot of this material is overwhelming. You're trying to remember this, and how do I do this? How do I do that? How do I make myself feel better about that? She said, if you do that one thing, stop that self-criticism, your whole life will change. And so I think for me, that was real important, right? And I'd even say for students, that is real important, right? Because there's something about that self-criticism that can, you become your own worst enemy, right? And you begin policing yourself. So that's the only thing that I can add to this aspect of this conversation, because I truly am a student in this area. So thank you so much for all of those suggestions, Tiara.
Marcia, I mean, I just think that was such a great contribution. Let's not downplay it, because I think it's important. You're right. Let's not self-criticize. We have that running monologue in our head all the time, and we are internalizing these messages and policing ourselves, right? We are internalizing messages that are not about empowering who we are as a people, and it can paralyze us. That is so true and so key. In terms of me, I'm sort of in the fence too. Like, I don't do as much self-care as I should. But on the radical side, I have a friend who calls me weekly and is like, what did you do for self-care this week? So accountability. So having friends who hold you accountable to doing your self-care, that was super radical. She was like, you got to do it. The other thing, though, I do love to take nice baths, and I draw up a nice bath, a little, bring up a glass of wine and have some nice music, maybe even a candle, and it really sets the stage for me. And it's just like one of the things I like to do for myself at least once a week. So that is something that I try to do for my self-care. We are at 2:25. I'd want to acknowledge Sunday. Thank you so much for your comment. I think that's going to be a larger discussion, and it might be one of the topics coming on down the line for I am a Black woman, yes, I matter. So stay tuned, because I think that we can dig deep, but today is not the day. We've got 4 minutes. Anything left that you guys want to say, Tiara or Marcia?
I'll just end by saying to remember to take care of yourself during this time, especially as we continue to resist, as we continue to work towards a more productive, intentional, and brighter future for our Black children, and for just our Black selves, to remember that we resist out of love. And so that love stems from the self, and how important taking care of yourself is right now, especially as educators, especially as administrators in higher education. Come back to yourself and make sure that you are filling your cup so that you can continue to fill others. So that would be my closing comments. Take care of yourself and let us know how we can serve you in that way.
I would say, and yes, I think Sunday asked a great question. I would just mention one. We do an analysis of Lupe Fiasco's Lamborghini Angels video. So I don't know if Sunday is familiar with that, but please watch that. It absolutely addresses this issue. This has been going on for quite some time, because the violence they experience is not just in physically, but it's also mentally, right? And many of our artists are responsible for that. But I don't want to get off track. I would say in conclusion, what I am hoping is that we take advantage of this moment in history. History is cyclical. And so we do not have a lot of time to make the changes that need to happen before that door closes again. So I'm hoping that we will, in our communities, gather together and in a positive way, make sure that these changes are going to happen outside of the protests. The protests are very important, but you also have to have an action plan that you can give to the government in your community, to give to the administration at your college, give to your supervisor at your workplace. You need to have some sort of written action plan, right? That's written down so that when this moment passes, you have a document of what were the requests, what were the demands, right? And the changes that you want to see, because white people have a very short memory for this stuff. Okay. Very short memory, or their memory will change. You know, if you read George Orwell's Animal Farm, fantastic book, it really describes the human condition. Yet the wording will be slightly different than what was verbally agreed upon. So I really hope that we can take advantage of this time in a more thoughtful way, so that we can actually see lasting change and not wind up 30 years from now in a similar situation.
Thank you. And with that, I think we're going to close. Remember, be actionable. It was great that you engaged with us in this conversation. You've gotten some awesome tips between the first panel, the second panel, that you can take to action tomorrow if you would like. So, definitely go ahead and get started. We want to make sure that conversation, dialogue turns to sustainable action. That is the key. Thank you all so much for hanging in. I see some people were on both. So you've been hanging out with me for the last 3 hours almost. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I feel all the love. Stay tuned. We will obviously be coming back. Like I said, this is a monthly series. So stay tuned for our next one. You guys have been awesome and amazing. Peace.